comparative perspective of medieval Jewry, quite interesting. My question is a little bit methodological, like Carlos before me. Can you find similar data on conversions that you mentioned in medieval England and Germany or France?
Yes.
For Spain?
Yes. Well, that's part of the challenge of studying this topic, because we have very uneven types of primary sources available to us. In the Crown of Aragon, record keeping was taken very seriously, and we have many documents that survive to this day. We have very few comparable records, for example, from Germany, except in Cologne, I think, and from northern France as well. We don't have really many, but for England, we have many sort of archival records. We have rabbinic responsa from across most of Western Europe. We have literary sources from across much of Western Europe. So the source base is uneven and fragmentary in every way. That's part of the challenge, but I think it's nevertheless very striking that what does survive is incredibly similar across the entire region.
Because I was wondering also another measurement of integration or flexibility or fluidity would be a geographical or residential segregation, what the degrees of, because all of this is a question of degrees, obviously.
Yes.
I was wondering, or levels of commercial interaction, or other forms of sociability. If
Yes.
there is anything.
You mean between converts and Jews or Christians?
Yeah.
So
Well, converts,
yes.
Jews, and non-Jews.
Yes, for sure, for sure. I just think it's interesting to apply this lens of conversion, given that it's in the past been used to try to display stark contrasts between Northern and Southern Europe, to use that same lens, looking at a different type of conversion, and instead showcase some very similar patterns and continuities. But it in fact, of course,
No, that's an open question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that there were sharp contrasts or there were not.
So for sure
It
there,
would
yeah.
be interesting to know what degree of contrast there was. There
Yes.
were. I mean, it's interesting also that work by Anita Novinsky in Brazil, and then more recently Jonathan Israel and Stuart Schwartz, also in Brazil, showed that for the 15th century, a much greater degree of openness, that many of these conversos were Catholics like any other one, a surprising degree of tolerance in the
Yes.
Lusitanian Atlantic.
So that's part of the story for the earlier period as well. I couldn't include it for today, but it's very interesting. We see Jews continuing to to have economic interactions with converts. We see romantic ties persisting after conversion, which is a complicated subject. So even in this period, it wasn't so cut and dry. Although what I presented is the dominant, the dominant picture. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
What were the dictates from Rome and also Hispania, and were they different? And what was their influence on conversions, or were there dictates specifying that X number of Jews had to be converted?
To my knowledge, there were not dictates specifying that certain numbers had to be converted, but the Pope very much wanted to, popes across the centuries I'm discussing, of course, celebrated Jewish conversion and tried to encourage it, tried to help individual converts who were destitute, and kings were in an interesting position because on the one hand, they didn't want to lose Jewish subjects. On the other hand, as Christian monarchs, they had to appear pious. So at least rhetorically, they very much supported Jewish conversion and sometimes would pardon a crime if the Jewish culprit converted, and made gestures of this kind to try to seem pious. It's complicated subjects. Yes.
Was more prevalent by the church in Hispania versus Northern Europe?
We see the same encouragement across both regions, I believe. Yes.
I think you've raised, among many other questions that you have raised one very important: what does it mean for somebody to convert and reestablish or establish a certain relationship with the new community and with the community from which this individual converted. And I think in a certain way my question or commentary dovetails a little bit with what has been said now, is how in that case the king, the law, the legislations implement strategies in order to delay the social and political effects of conversion. I am thinking here, for instance, something that I feel that is, perhaps I'm completely wrong, I don't know, but it is a moment that is extremely important, which is 1449, in which in Castile there is, they implement a specific strategy to delay the effects of conversion when they apply to converts the laws on nobility, telling them, as a matter of fact, you converted, but you are not yet a Christian. Only 2 generations later, your family will be a family of converts. So this particular strategy to delay the social and political effects of conversion is, that as more or less as it happens in 1449 in Spain. Is it something that also happens in other communities? Is it something that is somehow implemented in other spaces?
Much earlier you're asking, in the period I was discussing.
For
example.
instance,
So
yes.
I think David Nierenberg is really the expert on this question, but I would just, regarding the 13th and 14th century, say that I think with the statutes you're discussing, they were controversial at the time, and it took a while, and they spread gradually. But no, I have not come across that earlier. On the contrary, we see bishops and kings providing begging licenses for individual converts, which say, trust this person, he or she is a devout Christian, give them alms, support them, lest they return to Judaism. So on the contrary, we see Christian officials trying to encourage the Christian flock to be generous and welcoming toward converts so that they won't be ostracized and commit the abomination of returning to Judaism.
My question is really very simple. It grows out of ignorance. What was the justification for forced conversion? In other words, how could that be construed within the body of the religious doctrine?
Yeah. So it's incredibly complicated and controversial, and circumstances depended on the specific time and place and moment and the individuals involved. So it could be very different in very different cases. And there was controversy within the church as to whether, although in the end it was said a baptism is a baptism, once you're baptized, you're officially a Christian, and if you deviate, the church can punish you. Nevertheless, for example, there's an incredibly interesting trial record that's extant from 1320 in the south of France of a Jew who was forcibly converted during the Shepherd's Crusade. His name was Baruch. And you see him asking different Christian authorities, am I really a Christian? I was baptized, but I was dragged into the church, and they beat me, and they forced me to say it was voluntary. Like, I had to say the words, this is voluntary. And some of the Christians he asks, who are clerics, say, no, it doesn't actually count. But of course, he's arrested by the Inquisition later for backsliding, and ultimately, after months and months, he's forced to toe the line. I don't know if we actually know what ended up happening to him, but in his testimonies, you see that different Christians have different ideas about whether his forced, violent, horrible conversion, people broke into his home and dragged him out and beat him, was valid, even though, according to canon law at that point, it was. Nevertheless, Christians aren't agreeing.
Is there any way to assume or even establish that forced conversions were more prevalent in Iberia than in any other part in Europe?
So the forced conversions of 1391 are by far the most massive, numerous forced conversions that take place at one time. They happen in Iberia in 1391 at the end of the period I discussed. But we have smaller episodes of forced conversions throughout Jewish history, most famously starting in 1096 when many Jews also chose martyrdom over conversion in Northern Europe and also in Spain. Martyrdom and forced conversion in both places.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I'd like to follow up on that question on that and that answer as well. So you're pointing towards the messiness of what counts as compulsory conversion, right? But at the same, on the other hand, you're using the word voluntary in a kind of loose way. So it strikes me that among some of these Christian clerics that you're talking about, compulsory conversion comes to be voluntary, right? There's a kind of redefinition of what counts as compulsion and what counts as a voluntary act. So there's a parallel sort of dichotomy, right, in the Jewish literature about a forced convert versus a voluntary convert. So I'm wondering if there's any sense in which the kind of the taxonomy of voluntariness in the Jewish community actually encounters the parallel taxonomy of what's compulsory and what's voluntary in the Christian community, and what that conversation looks like.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Different scholars have different opinions about that. You would assume that the Jewish community might be more forgiving of someone who was forcibly converted than somebody who, either out of faith or intellectual conviction or circling to provide greater convenience, chose to convert when nobody was threatening them with a sword. It's not exactly clear. People have looked at the words used to describe the different kinds of converts in Hebrew. Some people have argued that there really isn't a difference, but I find that hard to believe. So it's a question that is debated for sure among Jews and among Christians, both with their own sort of agendas in mind to try to bolster, cohesion and strengthen their own communities. But it's a fascinating topic to look at both in conjunction with one another.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
I like the idea. I think one of the things, if you want to actually do that, you'd have to say, what are the possibilities and therefore what are the motivations for rabbis writing about their definitions versus Christian clergy writing about their definitions? They're writing from different positions of possibility of what their legal arguments or legal interpretations of categories can possibly achieve.
Yeah.
Right? They're in very different worlds.
And there's interesting mirroring, right? A voluntary convert in the Jewish community is someone to be shunned or someone to be attacked, whereas that voluntary convert from the other side is the exact opposite. So to be celebrated.
So I would say it very much depends on the context. For example, traditionally as understood in Northern Europe and Ashkenaz, since the ideal was martyrdom, that even at sword point you would convert, that you still had the choice to die rather than become a Christian. And the honorable, noble thing to do was to choose death over baptism. So in that sense, it's complicated when one asks, what does it mean to have a choice? Is death preferable to baptism or not? But absolutely, I'm completely agreeing with what Jonathan said. But martyrdom is sometimes the ideal that's upheld. It's complicated.
Maybe we'll take a 10-minute break, stretch our legs, use the bathroom, walk around.